So the other major catalyst was and I can't remember the name of it, but the program was our common future. It was a UN, United Nations sponsored group, and the chair of that was the Prime Minister of Norway, whose name was Brundtland. That's Gro Harlem Brundtland.
Okay.
So she headed this UN group with worldwide consultations on our common future, and that was a report. And it was her report that coined the term sustainability. And that was, so this wasn't forestry oriented. Her committee, it was world globally oriented to agriculture and our ways of living, and including forestry. So sustainability became the watchword. And so us foresters said, well, that's right on. Yeah, so the foresters, our forestry community agreed that this was a no-brainer, that we've been practicing sustainability all along, until we finally realized, no, we hadn't.
Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. I'm Matthew Kristoff. On this podcast, we talk about environmental sciences. I bring on researchers and forest professionals to talk about their work and just kind of try to broaden the scope of understanding of environmental issues, that exist today. Today's episode is pretty specific to Alberta and to forestry specifically. I brought on Peter J. Murphy, and Peter Murphy is, by all accounts, one of the fathers of modern forestry, at least in Canada and Alberta, that's for sure. And, he's been around a long time. He's seen it all, from everything from, just cutting down trees for the sake of having wood to all the way up till today to, we're managing for not just timber values, but for everything, right? For multiple use, for recreation, for water, for biodiversity, for everything. So we're taking all these things into account to make sure that we have a sustainability aspect involved, right? So I brought him on, and he's got a million different things to talk about. So we tried to narrow down a couple things. And the main thing I wanted to get his perspective on was sustainability, and that shift that we've seen from just cutting down trees for the sake of cutting down trees and having lumber and economic value, into recognizing that there's more to it than that, and that people want sustainability above all else, right? And if we can get timber through sustainable activity, great. But if we can't, then we shouldn't be doing it, right? So there was a shift that happened sometime in his tenure as a forester, and he's been around since, I think he's been a part of it since the 50s, or since maybe even the 40s actually, and he's still around today to talk about it. And he's a historian, an environmental historian, so he knows a lot about a lot of the policy and the regulations that went into changing societal view of how we manage forests and stuff like that. So it was really, really cool to get him on and get his perspective on the changes that we've seen and why we saw them. So at the very beginning of the conversation, we had about the first 37 minutes was just him breaking down his his past up until about the 90s or so. And it's really, really interesting for those of you that are foresters or that know Peter or have heard of him. You might want to check that out as well. I'm going to put that at the end of the podcast. So after the meat and potatoes of everything, if you want to learn about Peter's background, which is also very, very interesting. I mean, like I said, he's the father of modern forestry. He was a part of building both the technical schools, or a bunch of different technical schools, as well as the university programs. Part of the discussions around what sustainability means, regulating the profession so that we're held accountable for what we're doing on public lands, all kinds of different stuff. It's really, really incredible. So if you want to hear that stuff, you can listen to it at the end. And so it'll be the last 30 minutes of this episode. So the reason I cut right into it was because I was thinking that there's some people that might want to just hear his perspective and not necessarily be interested in where he came from. So I threw it at the back. So for those of you that want it, it's there. And the catalyst for bringing Peter on was actually the Dominion photographs. The photos were taken by the Dominion. So this was back in the 1800s before Alberta existed as a province. And these photos were taken as kind of an inventory and checking on wildfire activity and that kind of stuff. And they were kind of lost for a long time. And they were found again, I think he said, very recently in the last couple decades. And Peter's been going through them and just discerning information from them and just learning from them. And it's been really interesting. So eventually, about halfway through the episode, we get into the Dominion photographs. So when we start talking about Dominion photographs, that's what that is. It's just it's the photographs from, over 100 years ago of forests and ranger cabins and just the activity that was going on back then and what we can learn from that. That was the catalyst for this episode. But we started off talking about his own opinions and how he thinks that we got from sustained yield, meaning just cutting down trees and letting it be, not reforesting or anything like that, and how we grew into this all-encompassing management system called sustainable forest management, where we're managing for sustainability above all else. So, it's been, it was really, really cool. And I really want to thank Peter for his contribution, because without him, we wouldn't have, sustainability the way we have it today. He's really an incredible person. He's done so much for environmental sciences and for sustainability. And we all owe him a great deal. So, I hope you guys like it. Sponsors for this episode are Greenlink Forestry. Thank you so much for your contribution. I appreciate it. Damaged Timber. Damaged Timber is an apparel company. They support environmental sciences through the sale of their clothing. So 10% of everything they make goes towards a scholarship for environmental sciences students, which is pretty awesome. And they're actually certified 2% sustainable. I forget, 2% conservation, I think, on their website. It's really, really cool. And if you go to their website, buy their clothes, you're supporting environmental sciences. So that's pretty cool. Check them out at damagedtimber.com. Put in your forest 10 at checkout, and you can get 10% off. Also, most importantly, our biggest sponsor this year is West Fraser. Thank you so much for your support. It allows me to continue to spend a bunch of time, finding people to talk to and getting these discussions out there for the public and for professionals to better understand our natural world. So thanks so much, West Fraser. Appreciate it. Hope we can keep a good thing going. And without any further messing around, let's get into it. Here is Peter and myself. My goal is to get you to talk about yourself a little bit. I know you're not, you tend to be pretty humble from everyone every time I've heard you speak. So I want to try and get you to talk about everything that you've accomplished a little bit, just to get things started. Yeah. So let's just talk about how you got into forestry in general. Like what brought you into this whole thing, and all the change that you've made has been pretty drastic over your career. So let's just talk about how you started.
Well, it's good question. I think, yeah. So getting started was clearly a family thing. My grandfather in California was a naturalist. He was a horticulturist. Okay. Grew strawberries and other plants, but he was a strong supporter of John Muir and the Yosemite Park and the conservation. Yes, mm-hmm. And he was an ornithologist, amateur ornithologist. In fact, one of my cherished books is an ancient volume of Birds of California that he sent me when I was just a kid.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So I was raised in the Montreal area.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
okay.
My dad had met my mother when he was at University of California for a year. Took her back to Montreal. And they were outdoor people. My mother was a
California to Montreal.
It was. I admire my mother. She took up skiing. She learned French. And
oh, wow.
Yes. She really adapted. So we skied as kids in the Laurentians, and that was a neat natural environment. So we were made familiar with the forests and activities in them. So when it came time to, I was interested in biology in school. In high school, we had a biology teacher who was, interestingly, at a high school level, he had a PhD, and his depth of knowledge was so great, and he was an early ecologist. And I was interested in wildlife, of course, because we lived in a rural area and we hunted and fished and
my kind of
had that back. Yeah. It was good. So my dad arranged for me to speak to a wildlife biologist. I think in retrospect, he was with Canadian Wildlife Service, but his headquarters was at McGill University. And he was a real downer. He didn't. He recommended that I not go into wildlife, that there were no jobs, there was no future. It would be just frustrating.
You know, I've heard that. I heard that when I was going into forestry, 10 years ago, I heard that. Like, no, it's going to go out of business. I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah. So it seems there's a lot of that out there, I guess. Yeah.
So we talked, and he introduced me then to another fellow. I don't really know how they were acquainted, but it turned out he was the tie buyer for Canadian National Railways with the headquarters in Montreal. A fellow named Winiger, like vinegar with a W. I found one of his speeches later on, in fact, just a few years ago. And I was quite impressed with his knowledge. He was not only a tie buyer, but he was a forestry background.
Okay.
And he encouraged me to go into forestry. Thought it was,
and what year was this?
That would have been in...
I think it's important to point out the timeline here.
Yeah. No, for me, it would have been 1947.
There you go.
Yeah.
So that's early forestry time.
Finishing high school, yes. And forestry was largely industry-oriented at that time. Forestry was getting the wood out of the bush and timber cruising and logging and so on. But silviculture was starting to come along.
Yeah.
Anyhow, that convinced me to take forestry, and I chose University of New Brunswick as the closest one and highly recommended at that time.
And then from there, when did the registered or the RPF system come in, the registered professional forester? Because you're number what? Are you number one? Are you number two? You're number two. Who beat you out?
Arden Ritz.
Oh, right. Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that brought me to Edmonton, and I could get more involved in that sort of thing. But we had talked. What can I say? I think it was 1956. When I was early here, we talked about registered professional foresters, and there weren't enough of us really to...
Well, I mean, to put it into perspective, I became an RPF, I think 7 years ago, and I'm 1774. You're number two, so that's just for the province.
Yeah.
So
well, that was a major effort. There were a number of us that thought we should do it, but we were too early on the scene. So we had a meeting in, it was 1955. At that time, there was a group of foresters in Calgary. There's a Dominion Foresters and the Eastern Rockies guys. And then there were a group of foresters in Edmonton. And we were the Forest Service and the industry people. So our CIF meetings, our forestry meetings...
Canadian Institute of Forestry.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
We held them in Red Deer.
Oh, okay.
In the basement of a Chinese restaurant.
Nice.
Yes, yeah. So that's where it was halfway.
You got good snacks.
We did, yes. It was good. That's how it, I've looked for the place since, but I haven't been able to find it. But really, it should be a forestry place of interest.
Historic site.
Historic site, yeah.
Hopefully it's still around.
Yeah. So we agreed at that initial meeting that we should pursue registration. And the ones in charge then, the senior guys at that time, did, and they didn't get anywhere. So we agreed to keep in touch. And I can't remember. I have it written down, and I wrote a history of what happened.
You wrote a few histories of what happened.
Yeah, on that one. That's right. And I don't remember the years right offhand either. But it was a long struggle, and what really made it for us was Frank Appleby, who was MLA from Athabasca and was of a logging sawmilling family. Took us under his wing and said, yes, you should be registered. So he fronted for us in the provincial government, and we worked on the draft act and all the other
stuff. So you were involved from everything right from the beginning, it seems like, almost, in Alberta. Like you're I mean, there's some people pointed out that you might be arguably the father of modern forestry in Alberta, at least, which is a pretty high accolade. I would say you deserve it too.
No, I would say the fathers were really Hustis and Crossley and Reg Loomis, those three. Yeah.
Well, it's important to be humble.
I got in on their coattails. Yeah. So that's right. We spent a lot of time on that. And I just wanted to say that there were 10 of us were signatories to the act and got it approved. And so we agreed among us that we would draw for who got what number.
Oh, that's how it happened. What happened. Oh.
Well, that was our agreement. And then when we actually met, I was chairing that group. I suggested that number one should go to Arden Ritz because he was the longest in tooth and had been at this the longest. And he was very effective in getting industry to accept the fact that we should be heading in that direction.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome.
So they agreed. And then Jim Clark said, well, I should be number two. But then the rest of them
tell me you fist fought him for it.
No. So that was good.
That's awesome. Well, I want to get into some of the questions that I kind of devised for you, just to try and tease some of your thoughts about forestry in general, and the changes that have come over time, right? I mean, it's come from a place of, it was part of the Dominion back in the early 1800s, part of the, right, and then slowly started to develop into an actual forest management base, right? So what do you think created that transition from just a timber values only, right, to just trying to produce lumber and wood and that kind of stuff, to this transition into sustainable forest management? So looking at the forest for a united front and an ecology aspect rather than just the timber values. Why do you think that happened?
No, on the evolution of forestry, I think the Eastern Rockies Forest Conservation Board was established in 1947 and 1948. That was the first, to my mind, the first attempt to look beyond forest as a timber supply only.
So that was in the 50s.
That's quite remarkable, yeah. And the fact that it had problems was as much administrative and government. But so I can't really answer your other question about when did it start. But when I came on as acting chairman it was in 1970. Well, it was in 73. I was then at that time the universities, there were 6 universities, forestry universities in Canada. Their deans had got together the year before to form an association.
Okay.
To lobby, because they realized that they were underfunded. All of the universities, forestry universities, were underfunded, and there had to be a change of philosophy. There had to be more inclusive and embracing of the forest as a whole. So I got to be the Alberta representative on that group, and we did a lot of lobbying, major lobbying, because the other universities. Well, I should explain that at the university, teaching is one of the things that's done, but the other thing of equal or greater importance was the research aspect, where the universities were expected to be generating new knowledge and understandings, and so on. And the forestry universities had mostly been seen as overstatement, but they were more trade schools than they were research institutions.
Right.
And of course,
teaching how to do the logging, timber cruising, and the actual practical values there.
Yeah. And they did a good job of that, but they weren't that research oriented. So part of our objective as the group of deans was to try to tap more research funding. So we had meetings. We had a lot of meetings in Ottawa. The Canadian Forest Service was one of our major sponsors in there that welcomed us and introduced us around to the federal ministers. The National Research Council, National Sciences and Engineering Research, we met with the Humanities Research, the industry, FERC. So, and we met with ministers of the government and so on. So that was one thing, was to try to get support for the universities. And it took a while to generate, because we were dealing with established scientists at National Research Council who had sponsored a lot of research, well, major research sponsors in the fields of science and engineering. And forestry really wasn't on their radar. So there was a lot of changing of minds and back and forthing.
So even then, you guys were trying to push the idea of sustainable forest management and not just the...
No, that was still sustainable forestry.
Sustainable, just trying to convince,
So this was in the 70s still.
Yeah.
And I have to watch where I go here. So the other thing that was happening was there was concern among Canadian foresters that forestry was not regenerating. That the initial push, we had so much forest in Canada, and it was a major employer, and we knew from the results of the forest inventory that there was a lot of timber there yet. And the main concern was the economic contribution of the forest industry to Canada, and that was a legitimate thing to do. So the training at universities was largely in that respect. And we came to the realization in 1974 that the studies of regeneration, there was a belief, but it was a myth, that nature grew the forest in the first place, and after we logged them, nature would take care and bring them back.
So it just kind of cut down and left at the time, yeah.
Yeah, and that's overstating it, because there was some good forestry practices developed in places, but that was kind of a prevailing attitude. So there were national meetings to try to get this going. There was one in 1966 in Montmorency, Quebec, where that Des Crosley had been to, and some of the other leading Alberta foresters. And Crosley was a major force because he was articulate and far-sighted. And so he was advocating that we should try to ensure that legislation in the provinces insisted on regeneration as part of the forest management responsibilities. And that hadn't always been the case. So Crosley at this 1966 and his associates made this strong plea, but it didn't go anywhere. And the next one was in 1977. I don't want to go through a catalog of...
But you think that was just the resistance to do this kind of like silvicultural aspect and like replanting trees, and was that just an economic resistance, you think?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so, largely, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think the turning point was in 1977. That's to answer your question. There was a National Forestry Generation Conference held in Quebec City.
Okay.
And it was organized largely by foresters through the Canadian Institute of Forestry. So we had foresters from industry, foresters from the provinces, and they all deplored the fact that we were not regenerating, and in many cases the legislation in the province didn't require that. So this was really a call to action. So I think that was the first really bringing it to light but trying to get some momentum built up, it was slow coming. There's a lot of resistance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I could imagine.
Just a bureaucratic resistance.
Yeah, for sure.
And it involved provincial legislation.
Mm-hmm.
And that changed in 1980 when there was another one. And by then the provinces were on board. I think they agreed finally that, yes, that they should have legislation that required regeneration.
Mm. So it took that long, eh?
It took that long, yeah. And so that there was a lot of people involved in this, and it kept the momentum going. There was a group of 100 so-called appointed from across the country to kind of keep things moving, and they did. And the Canadian Forestry Service was good in this respect as well. It hadn't any authority, but it had a moral leadership
for sure.
And then what really helped to change was that the forestry ministers finally got clued into this, and they developed the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers in 1987 and called a meeting about forestry practices. And it was that one that we did finally get a commitment.
Okay.
From
industry
and the provinces that they would require reforestation as part of their activities.
Yeah.
So it was kind of an unsung moment, but in my mind, that was really a pivotal.
It's huge.
It is huge. It was huge.
I think that's what opened the gates for not just reforestation, but for the rest of the forest values that were included, right? Those multiple use values.
That comes next,
right? Yeah,
that comes. So
that's what I mean. It just kind of gets everyone thinking about, okay, it's not just timber; it's everything else as well. So it's fascinating that it took. I mean, we've been doing forestry in this province or in Canada for ever, right? For 150 years or more, and it's interesting that it took. I guess it has such vast amount of forest that it's hard to worry about the little bit of timber you're taking back then compared to today. It's a different scope for sure. But it's fascinating that it took that long.
Yeah. So the other major catalyst was and I can't remember the name of it, but the program was our common future. It was a UN. United Nations sponsored group, and the chair of that was the Prime Minister of Norway, whose name was Brundtland. That's Gro Harlem Brundtland.
Okay.
So she headed this UN group with worldwide consultations on our common future, and that was a report, and it was her report that coined the term sustainability. And that was, so this wasn't forestry oriented. Her committee, it was world globally oriented to agriculture and our ways of living, and including forestry. So sustainability became the watchword. And so us foresters said, well, that's right on. Yeah, so the foresters, our forestry community agreed that this was a no-brainer, that we've been practicing sustainability all along until we finally realized, no, we hadn't.
Right.
Yeah, we've been focused on getting the regeneration.
Yeah.
Of course, that was the first step. That was a major
step
of changing the attitudes in that respect.
Mm-hmm.
So with that sustainability in mind, it was the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers and a lot of leadership from the Canadian Forest Service, people in. So CFS had a more major prominence in federal government than it does now. It was coming into its period of zenith in there. So the CCFM, Canadian Council of Forest Ministers, which includes the feds, thought, well, the best way to define is sustainable forest management, if that's what the way we want to go, would be to hold national consultations. And so they did. They held national consultations in...
Who were they consulting?
Everybody. This was remarkable, yeah. So they set up a subcommittee, and they organized. This was all done as a prelude to their proposed 1992 National Forest Congress, which is going to be held in Ottawa. So as a run-up to that, they had 5 regional consultations. And so there's one in British Columbia. There was one for the prairies held in Saskatoon. There was one in Winnipeg, Toronto, Quebec City. Yeah, and so people invited to those consultations, and they were consultations.
When you say people were invited, just anybody.
Anybody. In essence, yes.
So you're getting the public's view on
specifically any associations involved, and included all the NGOs. That was a new term. The NGO and the ENGOs were all invited.
Oh, cool. So what kind of responses were they getting from these groups?
Yeah. So I was invited to be a secretary on that, so I got to go along, and I was so impressed at those meetings because they were all facilitated, so the facilitators were objective, neutral, and they encouraged. We got the whole range of points of view from the industry people to the strongest environmental organizations.
That's awesome, because it's a lot better than a debate style thing, right? You just have a facilitator, and we just try to have a mutually respectful conversation about where we can go with this, right? And that's awesome.
Yeah, and I was just so impressed to see these what had been antagonistic people in those facilitated environments come together and actually agree on so many things, philosophically and in practice.
Yeah.
It was just remarkable.
It is amazing, right? Yeah. How people sit in their own little echo chambers and build themselves up in emotion and anger, and then they come together and realize, oh, everyone's actually pretty reasonable. Why don't we just discuss this? Yeah, like it seems to be a pretty common thread, but that's cool that even then we're getting some good conversations around that.
Yeah, and a few of the strongest Greenpeace wouldn't sign on at the end, but most of the others did sign on. So at the final meeting, there was a sign on. And then,
to what sustainable forest management meant and what we wanted to see. Okay. And then there was
it was published as a national forest strategy. That was the first one, 1992.
Okay.
That was an impressive document.
Yeah.
And it was largely honored. And then what came on shortly after that was the concept of certification. And then
So just becoming more and more strict with what we allow and what we need to do as stewards of the environment.
Not only stricter, but something that would have international recognition. So the certification was. Yeah. So we had Canadian Standards led one. I was on that one, and then I got to chair it for two of the standards that were.
You're just chairing everything back then, right?
Yeah. Well, it just seemed
Is there something you weren't a part of that we can talk about? Just kidding.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was.
So as time goes on here, and you've seen such a huge change in the forestry sector and environmental sciences in general, right? You've obviously had much more of a focus on the past, on history, right? Because you were part of the Alberta History Forest History Society, right?
Oh,
am I saying that wrong?
There is a Forest History Society, FHS, in Durham, North Carolina.
What's the association? What's the one we have here in Alberta? The one we had a meeting on last Wednesday.
Okay, that was relatively newcomer, but that's the Forest History Association of Alberta,
right?
FHA,
and you're part of that.
Yes.
And so what do you see as important about looking back into our history like that? Because you're looking back into as far as it goes, right? Into some of these Dominion photos that you guys have been looking at from the 1850s and other stuff like that. What drove that passion to want to see that change and to really develop your understanding of how things happened, right?
Yeah, I think our current interest in history is a late comer. During those 70s and 80s and early 90s, we were really trying to push for change.
Innovation.
Because we knew where we had been, and it was what we were doing was well-intentioned but inadequate. Mm-hmm. It's not answering your question.
That's okay. No, we're moving in the right direction. It's just a conversation, man. No worries. Yeah. But
so
like, what do you see as important about people looking back in history and understanding where we've been, right? To know where we're going.
I think it's the perspective,
right?
Yeah, the perspective of where we are now. We might deplore that we haven't got very far, but if we look back, we can see yes, we've made remarkable changes, and the knowledge that we've made them in the past, that we should be able to make them in the future. Mm-hmm. And consultation is a major way of doing it. Consultation and then doing things, actually doing. Yeah,
absolutely.
So the commitment through legislation and so on takes a little longer, but it's all part of the process.
That we were, it was wild, wild west at one point, right? It was just a free for all, just take whatever you want and homestead wherever you want. And it was just kind of, there's no real law or reason to anything. And then slowly with time, we have, there's timber births created, and there's just a slow and steady progression into this, some kind of management scheme, right? And we work our way into this place where we are today, where we're talking about, soil microbiomes and like just the tiniest little microbes in the soil is we're really doing research on and caring about, and how that impacts the rest of the big ecosystem, right? It's fascinating to see how things have gone, and it's that you're right. I think looking back into history really drives our understanding, right? Yeah, it's a fascinating way. So that's cool. Yeah.
There were good intentions in the past. It's interesting I don't want to get bogged down in Canadian history, but we confederated in 1867.
Right.
And
so it became a country. Yeah.
We became a teeny tiny country, but by 1870, British Columbia had agreed to join the Union. We got Rupert's Land. Mm-hmm. And so then we were a country, got Northwest Territories from Britain. That made us... We
just bought it from them, right?
the purchase, and the British did give us stuff too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, the purchase was to the Hudson's Bay Company for Rupert's Land. That was the big bucks.
And that's the biggest piece.
Yeah,
really, right?
I don't remember the number. It was about $10 million or so.
Oh, okay.
Which is a lot of money
back then. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's awesome. And then we slowly saw this shift. So looking into these photos that you've been looking at the last few years here, what kind of information have you been able to deduce from some of these photos? And like, what do you think is the importance of looking at these things? Because you've got photos from, what's the oldest photo you have?
About 1900.
1900? Okay. And what were they trying to achieve then? And what are you trying to achieve by, looking back at these images?
Yeah. So I have to go back.
Collect your thoughts. Yeah, that's fine.
Collecting thoughts. I don't want to give a lecture, but the steps were when we confederated in 1867. Mm-hmm. The fathers of Confederation, so-called, had to work out a deal with who's going to pay for what and how our revenue is going to be generated to keep this dominion and the provinces going. So it was a division of authorities and responsibilities there. So among them was like the federal government was naturally responsible for interprovincial affairs, national defense, for example, and railways, and then the provinces more stuff within their own borders.
Right.
So at that time, the provinces were given the authority over the forests, and the federal government did not. So, it's interesting that the authority over forests was really more related to generating revenues from timber dues and timber sales and so on to support the provinces than management. But that was implied as part of the responsibility as well.
Absolutely.
So, and the federal government had no responsibility for forestry, which has been a cop-out and a blessing of both as time went on. So when Rupert's Land was acquired, that was bought by the Canadian government. So there's no provinces between British Columbia and Ontario. And so the Dominion government set up its own forest service called the Dominion Forestry Branch. Mm. And it was established in 1899.
That's awesome.
And so for that point, the Dominion government developed a forest service. So it was dealing in forestry aspects with the provinces as co-equals.
Okay.
So there was empire forestry meetings, for example, within the British Empire. So we'd have representatives from the provinces, and the Dominion government would go as well because it had the largest forest service in Canada. So that got the feds involved. And then, but the provinces had their own. In Alberta, there was, and Saskatchewan, as settlement increased and communities developed and economic activity increased, they became eligible, they felt to become provinces. So in 1905, Saskatchewan and Alberta were both made provinces, equal to the other provinces in Canada, except that the Dominion government felt that the provinces weren't sufficiently mature to handle the natural resources, and they kept them. So Dominion government ran the Forest Service here in Alberta, and of course they ran the oil and gas, coal, and other things too. That didn't change till 1930 when the resources were transferred. But you need that perspective to know because the Dominion Forestry then from 1900 was running the forests, and these photos that they were taking was part of the record that they were keeping. It was also a time of the early conservation movements too, and what they were trying to show with photographs is the state of the forests to Canadians and the problems with the forests, and the fires particularly.
Oh, okay.
Some of insects and disease, and the need for research.
Yep.
And the values, multiple values for watershed. Yeah, there's a statement by one of their foresters in 1910 that is just a classic even today about their concern for the range of values inherent in the forest.
Right.
So you're asking about the photos then. The photos give us a record of how the forest looked at that time, and interesting to see the technology that was applied to the pack horses and building trails and bridges and telephone lines and lookout towers, ranger stations. It was just developing the infrastructure, and it was all based on the problems with fires particularly, and managing logging and that sort of thing. So it's a visual record of the forests and the activities that were undertaken at the time.
Yeah.
And gives us a perspective from whence we've come.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And so most of that interest came, you said, from like this suppressing fire, that kind of thing. That came from protecting timber values for the most part, I imagine, right? Originally, like in the...
No, yes and no.
Okay.
So it was understood.
There was more thought put into it,
Yeah, I think one of the remarkable things was so that the Northwest Territories were acquired, I think it was in, say, 1870, thereabouts. Mm-hmm. And they were covered by the Dominion Lands Act. And what I'm driving at is that the Dominion Lands Act was amended in 1885 with a clause that recognized the importance of forests from a watershed standpoint. Mm. And it gave the Dominion government the authority to reserve from logging and settlement.
That's incredible. In 1885,
protection
they figured that out.
Of areas that were of particular importance for water.
That's amazing that they figured that out. You know what I mean? That's
it was far-sighted.
That is very far-sighted.
Not generally recognized.
Yeah.
So on the strength of that, coincidentally, the first Banff Hot Springs Reserve was in 1885. It was that same year. Oh. But then the Banff, which was then Rocky Mountains Park, started the next year. Mm. So that led to the reservations of the national parks along the and the national parks in Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan as well. And most of them, you can see on the map, are on the higher ground that were heavier rainfall areas, and they were important for watershed management.
That's incredible that they actually recognized that early. That is extremely far-sighted.
Far-sighted, yeah.
Yeah, because even today it wouldn't be public knowledge that, you know what I mean, that forests are a filter for our water system, right? So it's fascinating that whoever figured that one out, like, kudos to them.
There are good people involved.
No kidding, eh? So it's interesting to note too that even back that far, like, and I've said this a couple of times already, but that it seems there was still, even though we were thinking a lot about timber value and that kind of thing, there was even this look into water, right? Like, so there was some recognition that there's more going on here than just timber values and that kind of stuff, right? So moving forward into further into the century there, so these photos keep on. They kept these photos up through the 20s and 30s and that sort of thing.
Yeah, okay. So after 1930, they lost their management responsibility. So the photos more reflect the forest research activities that were going on, or some of the inventories into the Northwest Territories and Yukon. And
how much change do we see looking back at these photos from the 1900s to a similar photo from today? Is there a drastic difference, or is it a lot of the same kind of landscape?
It's similar now. The problem with the how can I say if to make comparisons, you have to be site specific. You have to location specific.
So it's changed enough that there's
and it's hard to tell from a photograph that was taken of a forest from whence it was taken, and so it's difficult to compare on that basis. So I'm getting equivocal here, but
there's lots to talk about, so it's hard to.
So more recently, in the last 10 years, there's been an ongoing study of reef photography in the mountain areas. And these have been really illuminating. So in this case, the photos that are being used are largely ones that were taken by the early surveyors, the land surveyors from the 1800s. And on into the 19... Yeah, right? It's the Mountain Legacy.
Yeah, I actually spoke with Rick Arthur on a previous episode.
Okay.
Yeah. We recorded from the top of one of the mountains overlooking Brule Lake, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
But those are the same kind of images that you're looking at here, though. They're fantastic.
Yeah, they are. So, but the photos, the Dominion Forestry photographs, do show forest stands, their composition, the sizes, and mostly they show the extent of fires and the problems of burning.
Yeah.
But they are important for perspective.
Do you think more people are getting interested in this kind of stuff, into the history of our forest and looking at it from a research perspective to try and understand where we might see it going?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah.
No, it's easy to not look back in your history and think that, like, oh, they were stupid, they didn't know what they were doing. Like, we're obviously more sophisticated now, right? But there's, like you were saying, there's lessons to be learned from that growth and from that change.
Yeah.
Right? So
and there's admiration to be given to those early people with the Dominion Forestry.
So something that I was reading through, like some of your slides a little while ago, and you had mentioned the change in forestry around World War II. So have you done much research into that? Just regarding the change in demand and kind of how the change in the workforce and that kind of thing, and how that affected the growth in forestry. Was that a part of what you've been looking into, or not really?
No, not. Oh, okay. That hasn't been a specific focus, but it's come out in our histories of, say, the Weldwood operation.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It was just something I recognized. I thought I'd ask, but it's not a big deal. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Bob Udell was the one that suggested we do a history of the Weldwood operations, and that stemmed from 19 from 1955.
Mm-hmm.
And that was early days.
Okay.
Too. So the initial operations there were largely hand tools. A lot of the fallers had just using bow saws and axes to cut pulpwood.
Yeah.
The power saws were just coming in. So that story is a good example of the history that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So it's tracing that early attempts and the earliest attempts at reforestation. And the first attempts were not particularly successful from our standards.
Yeah.
But they were a start, and we learned from them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's the important thing, right? Like, we're always moving forward. Like, I don't think it's always been perfect, but the fact that it continues to move forward and to build on the knowledge of the past.
That's right.
Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah, so you need that record of the past in order to build on it.
Mm-hmm. So, where do you see, looking at all of these things that have happened in the past, all this positive change that's come, recognizing our mistakes and changing them and trying to move forward into becoming more broad in our scope of understanding, where do you see, like, are you confident in, the research and industry's ability to move forward into the right space and to continue to, advocate for the right values? Or do you think it's going to become more of a, an economic crunch to try and make that profit? Or do you have faith in us to do this right? The way you guys have slowly been figuring it out over the time.
Well,
right?
I think we have the brain power.
Yeah.
We probably have the knowledge. Whether we have the will and the finances and commitment to do it is another question.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we've come a long, long ways from when I started. I know we have. So we are in fact looking at that sustainability factor, but we have the curve throwing at us now in the climate change.
It's a big one.
Aspect, and what the impact of that is really going to be. Variability is one thing. We have to hedge our bets.
Yeah.
And
what's the power of science, I guess, open. Right? Is just keep that research coming, and hopefully
it's a race between science and then change. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. No, there's a whole birth of science in there to determine what's going to happen with climate change and how the forests are going to change and how we should adapt. And that's a whole nother that's a whole nother.
So what I feel good about is we have good, well-educated and committed people out there working.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the foresters and all their allied disciplines are really well-educated and doing a pretty darn good job.
Yeah. No, it does seem like we're moving in the right direction, and that we start to see more restriction economically, but I think that's just going to happen as more values are being included and you know what I mean? But it doesn't mean that, I mean, in my opinion at least, like, wood is one of the only truly sustainable resources we have, right? If we do it right, sustainable forest management, but doing it wrong, then it can totally be detrimental and be a big problem. So I think we're slowly adding to that piece of the pie of that sustainable forest management, making it more complex and more, more inclusive of all values. And I think it's pretty awesome to see the change, right? The innovation.
It is.
Yeah. It's cool. Yeah,
heartening.
Yeah, no, it is. It really is. Yeah. I agree. Is there anything else that you think, or any other lessons learned that you think it's important for, people out there today to recognize while looking back into history, or just through, where we've been? Do you think there's lessons that people can take, like anything specific that you wanted to put out there? Yeah,
I might illustrate it with an example. When I came here I came here in the winter of in March of 1950
or 50. Okay, right.
54. Yeah. So at that time, the Forest Service head office was in the Natural Resources Building. It was called then. It was on 109th Street. And it was a building was shared with Mines and Minerals, of which we had been previously a part. And our equipment was stored in the basement. And so when we were getting ready for our summer cruise work, we had to go down there and rummage around through the calipers and the increment bores and the Abney hand levels and stuff. And in the equipment room, there was a a cabinet, an oak cabinet. It was a lovely oak piece of furniture. It was good, solid white oak, prime quality, with little drawers in them.
Yeah.
And we had to pull the drawers out, of course, to see what was inside. And here they were just all stacked with these photographs. And it turned out they were the Dominion forestry photographs that had been collected by the Dominion and turned over to the province in 1930.
Yeah.
And the province wasn't that excited about stuff that the Dominion had because this was Alberta's responsibility now, and we were going to do things better. We
kind of poo-pooed it, yeah.
Yeah, kind of, yeah. So that collection of photographs was not given a high priority by the senior people, but I think a lot of us at a more junior level could see the importance of them. So we tried to salvage them from being ransacked.
Yeah.
And we are too. So that's the nucleus of the Dominion Forestry collection that we've got now. And we've combined that with the one that Canadian Forest Service had compiled as well.
So what, just as a very general question, what are you hoping to accomplish with that?
Yeah, so for us who saw it originally, it gave us an instant perspective of from whence we had come. And it also conveyed the commitment of those people who were working in forestry at that time to do the right things that they saw them at the time. And I think that impression that we had is the one that people should have an opportunity to experience now, to look back and see the changes that have taken place. I think that perspective is important, both as an indicator that we need to keep progressing and recognize what a legacy we've inherited.
Yeah, no, it is. It's true. The fact that a lot of people back then were able to see the things that they saw was pretty fascinating, and to see where we've come is pretty heartening. And I'm pretty confident that we're moving in the right direction. Yeah, I don't think it's going to fall apart on us.
No. So the photographs were distinguished by a number that was written on the negative and appeared on all the prints. And we finally determined that was part of a national numbering scheme. We never did find the master file in the National Archives, but we can arrange the photographs in numerical sequence, which reflects quite well the time sequence in which they were taken. So that's what I'd like to see is this Dominion Forestry photographs. There's a major collection at National Archives. There's some at each of the Dominion Forestry headquarters, and there's scattered collections around Alberta and provincial archives.
That's awesome.
So it would be nice to get an effort where all of them could be scanned and assembled in one place in a scanned condition. And then we have a central catalog that would show us on a national basis from whence we've come.
Yeah, throw it up on a website somewhere too for everyone to see, right? For the public to view it and understand the changes that have happened there. Yeah. Do you have a favorite photo that you come across so far?
Oh, I think the favorite is the Ranger MacDonald on his homemade lookout tower.
Oh, okay.
Do you remember that one? I think there was 2 or 3 trees growing together, and he'd nailed ladder steps onto the trees, and the picture of him is Ranger MacDonald standing on the top of this homemade tower looking around.
That's awesome.
It is awesome.
Yeah, that's really cool. And that would have been at the turn of the century sometime then, yeah.
It was, yeah.
That's cool.
It is.
Because back then, it was just like what you were saying, right? Those fire towers were just whatever, hand bombed together with whatever tools at your disposal. And now we've got these 200-foot metal structures that I don't imagine they were that big before. Imagine if you got 40 feet, you were probably happy.
Yeah, 40 feet was good structure.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, this is great, Peter. This is perfect. I think we've covered a lot of the stuff. Unless there's something else you'd like to add to there was actually, you know what? There was one more thing actually that I wanted to ask you about that Richard Brand asked me to ask you about was, and this might take a few minutes, is the logging that happened in some of the national parks, right? Because I think there's a lot of people out there that look at Jasper and Banff National Park, and they see this pristine wilderness in quotes, right? And this is the way the forest should look, and this is what it should be like, and this is how we should model it. And from information that you've gathered, it sounds like a lot of that is actually secondary growth.
There was logging in the national parks. It wasn't probably that extensive.
Oh, okay.
The original, or at least the one that made the most had the most influence, was a guy named J.B. Harkin, Harkin.
Okay.
And he was both a visionary and a pragmatist. So his vision was to see our scenic natural splendors reserved as national parks, mm-hmm. to for all the protection that they could be given, and also to be visited and experienced. And but he was also, the pragmatic part was that he realized that this was going to take money, and if to get money through the legislative process meant that there had to be a public's interested in supporting it. Mm-hmm. So he felt very keenly that, firstly, the people should be encouraged to visit the national parks, and that was done very effectively through the CPR and the Banff and CNR in Jasper and others. And the other one was that there should be economic activity allowed in the parks so that they can help contribute to the national revenue, and then that would encourage industry then to support national parks as well, knowing that they were not going to be kept out of it. So there was some logging in Banff National Park. Certainly Yoho and Kootenay were logged, and there was logging going on there into the 70s. And there was coal mining, of course, in Jasper. And
so is there, like nowadays, can you go back there and is there any remnants of that? Can we find out where some of these stands were logged?
Yes.
Which ones are second? There is?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So where would someone get that data? Or is there signs up or something?
I don't think there's
not advertising it.
It's not being advertised, no. But yes, we've written stories and presentations on it. Yeah,
that's cool. No, it would just be interesting to know which, where some of these places are, and just to point out to people, right? Because it's something that I think that's one of the big holdups when it comes to logging and that kind of stuff, right? Is that people see a clear cut and they go, "This is horrible. This is deforestation. This is disgusting. Whatever they think." And then you recognize as time goes on and be like, "Well, what about the cut block across the road?" Like, that's not a cut block, but yes, it is. It is. That's 40 years old and it's growing back perfectly. And there's all kinds of habitat, and it's that disconnect between, forest grow, right? And we're stewards of the landscape and that kind of stuff. So that's a really good example to point out to people and go, yeah, you're you know what I mean? Your cherished parks that you think are pristine and natural and all this kind of stuff. It's like they're actually, a lot of it's been, or not a lot of it, but some of it has been, harvested at some point or another. But
yeah. There's a classic that I've used, photographs of the Bow Valley at Castle Junction. Mm-hmm. And the photograph taken at the time was of an absolute clear cut.
Oh, really?
Through there, it was clear cut and burnt. So you can see the stumps, high winter cut stumps, and they got char on them, and it's just wide open. And I personally found I had to search for that site.
Yeah.
And it took a long time, several visits, before I could reconcile that view with what's there now, because it had all grown up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah,
There's some of those stumps still around?
Yes, they are. So if you walk into the forest, you can see those stumps. Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah, they're starting to decay and topple over now.
That's cool. I remember someone was telling me about a story you told once where there was a place where there was like 10-foot stumps. And it was something about the snowpack level was 10 feet.
Oh, yeah.
And it was, so when it all melted, you're walking through and like, who the hell would cut a tree off at 10 feet? Like, what a waste, and like, what the hell's going on, right? But it turns out it was just the snowpack was that heavy. Where was that? Do you remember?
I don't remember that specifically. Would have had to have been in the mountains.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It would have to be in the mountains somewhere. Yeah. But it's a cool story though. But all that's hand fallen back then, I imagine. But
it was.
That's cool. Awesome. Well, thanks, Peter. This is great. I think this was we covered the gamut here, and there's always opportunity to do more if you're game.
Okay. Yeah, I'm game.
Awesome.
So the logging that Richard Briand was talking about was logging for railway ties, and that was more recent. That was in the 1920s.
Okay. Well, more recent. Only 100 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just a century. That's awesome. Yeah. Cool. There we go. That's it. Thanks a lot for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Peter is a wealth of knowledge, and I mean, if you heard him stumbling over his words, it was because he's trying to organize his vastly full mind, right? Try to get the information out without confusing everybody. So, I hope you guys could follow along. He's a great, awesome, really incredible person that, like I said before, without him, we would not be sitting where we are in the sustainable level that we are today. So thanks so much, Peter. You're the best. I hope we can do you proud. And so if you guys want to keep listening, after this will be Peter's actual, just kind of his life journey. So it starts off, the first 5 minutes are the same, and then cuts into the last little bit, which is, some of his coming into becoming a forester and the changes that he saw. It was really cool. So I hope you guys like it. And lots coming up for you guys, all kinds of cool stuff. We got stuff on indigenous burning practices and kind of what goes into that. And that was a really interesting conversation with Amy Christensen, and also some climate adaptation stuff. So how we can start adjusting industry and that kind of stuff towards climate change and expecting those changes, not just industry, but everything, just adapting to climate change so that we're ready and we're not caught off guard by it. So that one's going to be really cool. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one. We'll catch you next time.
Yeah. So getting started was clearly a family thing. My grandfather in California was a naturalist. He was a horticulturist.
Okay.
Grew strawberries and other plants, but he was a strong supporter of John Muir and the Yosemite Park and the conservation. Yes, mm-hmm. And he was an ornithologist, amateur ornithologist. In fact, one of my cherished books is an ancient volume of Birds of California that he sent me when I was just a kid.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So I was raised in the Montreal area.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
okay.
My dad had met my mother when he was at University of California for a year. Took her back to Montreal. And they were outdoor people. My mother was a
California to Montreal.
It was. I admire my mother. She took up skiing. She learned French. And
oh, wow.
Yes. She really adapted. So we skied as kids in the Laurentians, and that was a neat natural environment. So we were made familiar with the forests and activities in them. So when it came time to, I was interested in biology in school. In high school, we had a biology teacher who was, interestingly, at a high school level, he had a PhD, and his depth of knowledge was so great, and he was an early ecologist. And I was interested in wildlife, of course, because we lived in a rural area and we hunted and fished and
my kind of guy.
Had that back. Yeah. It was good. So my dad arranged for me to speak to a wildlife biologist. I think in retrospect, he was with Canadian Wildlife Service, but his headquarters was at McGill University. Mm. And he was a real downer. He didn't. He recommended that I not go into wildlife, that there were no jobs, there was no future. It would be just frustrating.
I've heard that. I heard that when I was going into forestry, 10 years ago. I heard that. No, it's going to go out of business. I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah. So it seems there's a lot of that out there, I guess. Yeah.
So we talked, and he introduced me then to another fellow. I don't really know how they were acquainted, but it turned out he was the tie buyer for Canadian National Railways, with the headquarters in Montreal. A fellow named Winiger, like vinegar with a W. I found one of his speeches later on, in fact, just a few years ago, And I was quite impressed with his knowledge. He was not only a tie buyer, but he was a forestry background.
Okay.
And he encouraged me to go into forestry. He thought
And what year was this?
That would have been in...
I think it's important to point out the timeline here.
Yeah. No, for me, it would have been 1947.
There you go.
Yeah.
So that's early forestry time,
finishing high school, yes. And forestry was largely industry-oriented at that time. Forestry was getting the wood out of the bush and timber cruising and logging and so on. But silviculture was starting to come along.
Yeah.
Anyhow, that convinced me to take forestry, and I chose University of New Brunswick as the closest one and highly recommended at that time.
Nice. That's awesome. So it's and then you came to, when did you come to Alberta?
Well,
hard to say.
Yeah. When did I come to University of Alberta? There are a few steps in between. So at UNB, on my mother's side, their family had a ranch in the Sierras. So I worked there. I worked as chore boy there for 3 summers.
Okay.
So, and that included my first year at UNB. My first forestry job was in Manitoba as part of the initial forest inventory. I wasn't too excited about working in Manitoba. No downers to Manitobans, but the areas that we worked in were not very exciting, but it was a good start. Mm-hmm. And by then, the national forest inventories were underway. It was an interesting period from a policy standpoint because the federal government and the provinces collaborated on a National Forestry Act, and the act allowed the federal government to go 50-50 in funding forest inventories, because the forest inventories were something that provinces just did not have.
Right.
Yeah, and that was the first departure from like getting into policy here, but it's interesting. Under our Constitution, the provinces have full responsibility for the forests, as for their management and their harvesting regulations and so on. And the federal government is not. Mm-hmm. So this Forestry Act in 1949 was quite an achievement for those who were involved at the time, because the federal government actually put in money. They did the forest inventories on a 50-50 cost-shared basis. Mm-hmm. And in Alberta, the director of forestry, Eric Hustis, arranged that these funds could be used for aerial photography. Mm-hmm. So in 1949, 51, we had the whole province covered with aerial photos and got started with a forest inventory.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So it was during that period, in my third year, I worked for the BC Forest Service on their forest inventory.
You're just jumping around province to province, eh? Like you're just going left unturned.
I was free, single, and having a ball. Yes, it was right up my alley. So in BC, that whole summer, I worked east of Prince George on the Upper Fraser, up into the Rockies there, and then later on in the east slope of the Coast Range. That was really an adventurous year. I had
no kidding. Like you're just coming from one end to the other. That's incredible.
So when I graduated in 1953, I went to work for the BC Forest Service again, continuing on the forest inventory. Saw the rest of the province. Yeah. But in my heart of hearts, I was still, because of my ranching experience, I was interested in grazing, and I was interested in wildlife. And it kind of off the topic, but in our senior year at University of New Brunswick, we had a course in forest policy. Dreadfully boring.
Anshel and I were just talking about how much we enjoyed our forest policy.
Well, yes.
It's changed, I imagine.
I tried to change it when I taught it here, yes. More exciting. But where was I going with that? Oh, yes. So the dean gave that talk, and it was rather a boring class. He talked about legislation in each of the 10 provinces and federal-provincial relations, which were... Yeah. But the thing that really grabbed my attention was in Alberta, he talked about the Eastern Rockies Forest Conservation Board. And that was I'll have to watch it. I'll start giving a lecture.
But that was in the 50s, though.
Yeah, so the Eastern Rockies Forest Conservation Board was established in 1947 and 1948. Mm-hmm. And it was in response to fires, a number of fires in 1936 that were really, really a wake-up call that the forests were flammable. Some of us are our earliest contemporary fires. So the federal government, and this was just at the time that Duke number 1 had come in, and the province was still impoverished, coming through the hard times of the 30s, and had no money. So the province agreed to go on on this agreement. It was a 14-year agreement, and the federal government the two of them would set up the joint Eastern Rockies Forest Conservation Board with membership of federal and provincial people. The feds had the majority on there, but they...
That's interesting that you had that kind of forethought coming in the 40s and 50s already, right? That conservation value, and that it's not just seeing the forest for the trees, but seeing it for all of its values.
Yeah,
right? That's incredible that it was that early on. It was
yeah,
right? Yeah.
So what appealed to me was about the policy was that they were looking at multiple use. That term hadn't been established yet, but they're looking at the grazing and the watersheds, particularly, and the forests and the wildlife fisheries, recreation. So I wrote to them to see if they had job openings. That really appealed to me. Hey, this is completely embracing. And they didn't, but they said they'd keep my application on file, et cetera, et cetera. So in the meantime, I went to the BC Forest Service. And
okay.
Yeah, I was really doing well there. I was having a good time. I was still single and out in the bush the whole...
Not spending a whole lot of time in bars meeting women, are you? You're just in the bush the whole time.
Yeah. Yeah, that season, we started in, it was early May, and we went into the end of the year. I came out of the bush in December of that year. It was just a marvelous period of time.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So what happened, it's a long story, and I'll just try to cut to the quick on it. But I had a cruise party. We were doing growth and yield studies out of Kimberley in British Columbia. And it was a fly camp. We were at the end of the road so what happened was that we were doing growth studies, so that meant taking increment corings and measuring the growth rate on the rings, and then we were following some of the trees and measuring them up for volume, and so on. So this one day, the two of my party chiefs came back, and they had plugged their increment bores.
Oh yeah, that happens.
Which happens, yes, and we didn't have any devices to clear them out.
For people who don't know, it's basically just a hollowed out drill bit, basically, and wood gets stuck on the inside for counting cores.
That's right. It's got external threads and a cutting edge in there. Yeah.
The wood often gets stuck on the inside there.
It does.
Pretty standard.
Yeah. And we learned afterwards we should get a long-stemmed extension
I don't know why they
bit.
don't come with like an unplugger, right? Like just some rod or something.
It should, yes.
You try and use a stick or something, and it just causes the same problem the opposite way.
Yeah. So the interesting timing of this was that there was at Kimberley, and these guys came in, and that was essential. So I took our truck and came out to Cranbrook, where the headquarters was, to see if and I did. I bought a couple more increment bores that we could carry on with. But when I got to Cranbrook, they told me that I just had a phone call from a guy in Crow's Nest Pass, and it turned out he was assistant chief forester for the Eastern Rockies, and he was in the Crow's Nest area, and I was in Cranbrook, and he wondered if I'd be around for the day he'd come and interview me.
Nice.
Because I had my letter from file. So he did. It was a great interview, and I was equally keen
That's awesome.
To have this opportunity, and they were interviewing for one particular job. So it turned out I wasn't successful on it. But again, they said they'd keep my letter on file. And they also were going to send a copy of my application materials to the Alberta Forest Service in Edmonton. And I hadn't really considered them. But then, as it turned out, in January, that was in January 1954, I got this letter from Forest Service in Edmonton saying they were looking for people to work on the forest inventory.
Yeah.
And would I be interested? And they offered me a job.
There you go. No interview this time. Just
no interview. Well, the interview had been done. They took.
Right, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I went. I ended my job in BC in February, at the end of February, and I took at that time I took the ferry. It was an overnight ferry from Victoria to Vancouver.
Nice.
That was neat. And
this is 1954 still. Yeah.
Took the train to Edmonton. We were working in shirt sleeves in Victoria.
Yeah.
When I left, and it was -30 when I got to Edmonton. Blizzard blowing.
Yeah.
That was,
a rude awakening, once again.
It was indeed.
That's awesome. Yeah. And then once you got here, you were involved with, everything, right? Like you were involved with starting up. Well, how many of the different training schools? You were involved in NATE. You were involved in the college, the university program. You're the dean of the university program. You're involved in all these different things, right? So
I had no inkling of what was coming.
Yeah.
But I did enjoy my work with so my first summer that was the summer of 1954. Mm-hmm. My assignment was to work on the forest inventory from Fort Mackay on the Athabasca River north to the Northwest Territories boundary, and to the Saskatchewan boundary on the east. It was a humongous big area, and we had a small crew with 3 canoes, and we went from Fort McMurray down the Athabasca River and back again.
Nice.
It was.
That would be a cool trip.
It was.
Yeah. Especially back then, right?
Yeah, and it's funny, it was mid-September, we were all keen to keep going, but they called us back to Edmonton saying the field season was over.
Yeah. At some point you got to get back to work, I guess.
Yeah. So we packed up our stuff, got on the NAR, the old Musqueam Flyer, and took the train back to Edmonton.
Nice. That's awesome. So
So then this next year it was forest inventory time again. So I had a cruise party north of Hines Creek in the Clear Hills.
Okay.
So we went in there with horses, and then we cruised south of Grand Prairie with horses down here at Musreau Lake in that area. So during that time, I finally heard from Eastern Rockies that they had a position.
Yeah.
And would I be interested? So yes, I would. So I took it, and what a disappointment. It was so disappointing. It was a lovely country. It was a country I'd really enjoyed and admired, and good people there. But the glory days of the Eastern Rockies had passed. They spent all their capital money. Their operating budget was lean. They didn't have a vehicle for me to get out to the forest with. I had to hitch a ride with someone who was going. And the management there was a federal provincial board, and I thought it was managed by, I won't give any names, but I thought the head people were conventional bureaucrats that were more interested in their own organizational stuff than getting things done.
Strangely enough, that hasn't changed.
Yeah. Hopefully it's not as bad. So I was wondering what to do, and lo and behold, the Forest Service advertised 2 positions. And of course, this was all over the radio, the forestry radio. And one of the positions was assistant superintendent at Edson. Now that one really grabbed my attention, because that again was what I wanted to do. Yeah. And the other one was to be the first one to head a new training branch that they had set up. So when after the Second World War and the reconstitution of working arrangements and rehiring people, they're trying to build up the Forest Service, and there were no trained people, or very few trained people, so they're hiring people off the street, so to speak, mostly off farms and trappers and people who had some knowledge, but they didn't know about forestry. So they had organized in 1950 a 10-week course that they held at Kananaskis. They called it the Forestry Training School. So it was kind of a cram course for staff to bring them up to speed. And the original people involved in that had moved on, and they were looking for someone
young and ready to go.
Yes. So I applied for both, as was suggested to me, and to my astonishment, I was given the training branch position. So that was in the
not something you saw yourself doing originally.
No, and
at this point, you were how old?
I was 24.
20. So yeah, you're still just learning this stuff yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm gonna be training people.
Yes.
I guess it's a different time, right? It's not as comprehensive back then as it is up to now, right? It's just beginning out, just starting to learn about the complexities of the forest and the relationships and ecology and water and everything. So yeah,
and a lot of the training was in timber cruising, and that I knew.
Just doing the timber stuff, right?
Yeah. So we got along famously with the students. They ranged in age up to old timers at that time. People in 50 were pretty old to me. But we developed a good rapport, and it was just a blast. So I ran the forestry school till there. Our last season was in the fall of 1959.
Mm-hmm.
And in the meantime, we extended training to others too. We got fish and wildlife training, towerman training, and then got into fire control training. So our little branch was, it was a good timing.
Yeah.
So, and we grew with that. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, and Norman Wilmore was minister then, and supported Eustace's request for funding to build a school, our own school at Kananaskis. The one we used at Kananaskis was the old remnants of the old prisoner of war camp at an early Dominion Forestry research station, and it was a lovely location. And at that time, there was not much traffic into the mountains, so we essentially had the Kananaskis Valley to ourselves.
So was this right after Kananaskis was? Or when was Kananaskis turned into a park?
Oh, a lot later.
That was later. Okay, so this was before.
So this was still part of the Eastern Rockies.
Okay.
Yeah. And the access was just the old forestry trunk road, which was gravel. But once the hunting season was over, the valley was empty, and so we had lots of room to move around and do our projects. It was good. So that's kind of leaping ahead pretty quickly. But then we did get the school at Hinton and built that.
Yeah.
Had the first programs in
Hinting Training Center.
When were we? Boy, I knew that. Yeah, it was 1960.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so our first program at 60 was the Junior Forest Wardens summer camp, and that was something that was given to us in the training branch too when they came along.
Getting kids involved in this kind of stuff. Yeah.
So once we had our own school, we just blossomed. We started in-service training in fire control, forest management, and fish and wildlife. We got programs there. We did training for provincial parks. And
everything.
Yeah, that's it.
Covered the gamut. Yeah,
we did.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was fun. We got lucky with staff. We got good people. And, And then in 1960, let's say it was around 1964. It was 64. I went back. I got that going, and then I took a year's. I got permission to take a leave to go to University of Montana in Missoula to do a master's.
Nice.
So the government had a policy there. You could go if you're doing grad studies, they'd pay 50% of your salary.
It's a pretty good deal.
It was a good deal. It was tough. We had 3 kids then.
Right.
But it was really a neat opportunity. So when I got back, Eustace, the director of forestry, in fact, he'd sent me a note while I was there that was quite intriguing, saying that he wanted to talk about another training possibility with the new Northern Alberta Institute of Technology. So when I got back, the 2 of us met with too bad I've lost his name. He was head of the of NATE at that time. He was the president of NATE, and some of his people. And their idea was that they would like to offer forestry as one of the technologies that they had developed, and they were geared up to give a 2-year program. We had advocated a 1-year program, similar to the ones that had already been established in New Brunswick.
Mm-hmm.
Laval had one. There was one in Ontario, and BC had the Ranger Training School. So we had an idea we could give a really intense 1-year program to train technicians. So this suggestion from Al Saunders was the president at that time, that we combine forces and offer a 2-year program. And what we agreed on was that we would do that. We'd have they would teach the first year at NATE in Edmonton, and for the second year the students would come to Hinton. So they'd get the advantage of all that technical expertise at NATE, and then we could focus on fieldwork at Hinton.
That's awesome. So that was the first kind of instance of a long process for education, I guess.
That came to be, yeah.
That's awesome.
It was. And again, we got lucky with staff we had, and we promoted ourselves through our staff to BC, and we were different from the other technologies in that we considered the whole multiple values of the forest. This was that was something that I really was glad we could do, because it reflected those broad interests that we had. So we found that our grads were really well received in BC because they were just starting to run into environmental problems, and our students had an understanding of them and could manage.
Yeah, that was when it was starting to get just riled up, and the kind of anti-logging, just environmental movement, I guess, right?
Yeah.
But
it was beginning,
yeah. Mm-hmm. So how long after till the university program started up? Because you were part of that as well, right? You were the first dean, I believe.
No, I wasn't the first one.
The first dean? Okay.
No, but I was involved. Des Crossley was a major person involved. He was a chief forester for Northwestern Pulp and Power. He had a master's. He was a research scientist, nationally well respected. And we were both living in Hinton, so we communicated. We were pretty good, and so we were consulted on the U of A's, and it was a U of A initiative to offer forestry. And when we talked to them, it sounded like a very reasoned position. It was going to be housed in the Faculty of Agriculture, and they had staff there that were competent in all the basic disciplines: the engineering, the biological, the soils,
everything.
Yeah, just not forestry as such. And we could help them choose people,
bring it all together. Yeah.
Yeah. So that program was approved to start in the fall of 1970, and Des Crosby and I were on advisory council and were involved in getting that going. The first. I applied. I was encouraged to apply as for. It was chairmanship of the Department of Forest Science at that time. I was encouraged to apply, but no, I wasn't successful. I couldn't compete with my master's, as good as it was, with the PhDs and others that were typically at the university. So they hired a guy named Jack Schultz who who was a University of Michigan forester, and I was teaching actually teaching forestry in Utah.
Okay.
Yeah. So he had familiarity with the West. He was a watershed man, and that tied in nicely. And then they hired, the second one was Jim Beck, who people will know here in Alberta. He was an inspired choice. So the two of them really did the grunt work of getting those first 2 years underway.
Yeah.
And the dean of the faculty at that time was a fellow named Fenton McCarty, who was a farm boy from Vermilion area, loved to hunt and fish, knew the forestry. He was just a down-to-earth person and a very human individual. And so he set a really wonderful tone for the whole thing, a whole collaborative tone. So forestry was integrated within the faculty without too much friction. It was really quite a remarkable thing.
That's awesome. I didn't realize that the faculty of Ailes existed before that. I thought forestry was kind of the first step in that, but there was already. I realized there was the agriculture, I guess.
Yeah, they started when the university started back in 1905. They have deep roots in there. That was, of course, we were an agrarian.
Right, primarily agriculturally focused. Yeah,
so that was a major one.
Yeah.
There. So what happened was we worked with them and we ran field camps for them at Hinton, and I think we developed some credibility with them. And so as they were expanding staff, they had a position for someone to teach fire and recreation, and those were both areas in which I had done some study and and work. So after long agonizing contemplation, I applied for the job and got it. And so I started at the University of Alberta in January of 1973. 73. So that was So I was still teaching and running the forestry school full time up to that point. So that was an abrupt transition for me. So I just got started doing my coursework. I had 3 courses to develop and give that winter term from January. The fellow who replaced me, John Wager, passed away. He died of a sudden coronary while he was skiing at Marmot Basin. He was standing at the top of the lift and told his friends to go on, and he just collapsed.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So they asked if I would come back to the forestry school at Hinton to help them get squared away. So I got Jim Beck and others picked up the coursework I should have been doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was a rocky start. But it worked out.
Yeah.
And then the next year, Jack Schultz got into a standoff. Jack had thought the university should be funding us to a greater extent than it was. The dean explained that they were limited in funding and this was the best they could do. And it came to a standoff, and Jack Schultz resigned as chair. So Fenton asked if I would act as an acting chair until they had a chance to advertise the position internationally, which they did. And I was selected at that.
Nailed it.
I nailed it that time.
That's awesome.